Welcome to Communication Techniques Training, brought to you by Sarah Oliver. Use Google Slides, PowerPoint, and Camtasia to make this presentation. This training is a review for an educational specialist, a guidance counselor, social worker, library media specialist, as I am, or other non-classroom teacher, speech pathologist, paraprofessionals, on the communication skills necessary to be successful in their jobs. It can be watched in parts and used as a resource. On your own time, you can take breaks, you can do some of the other activities as needed. By the end of this training, you'll understand communication competencies, learn instructional strategies to use in your job, and gain knowledge of ethics and diversity in your school. Communication starts in your brain. All of us can use a refresher on communication. It is essential to our jobs. And I found a quote here as a transition. Many of you probably know Tony Robbins, motivational speaker. But to effectively communicate, we must realize that we are all different in the way we perceive the world and use this understanding as a guide to our communication with others. So the reason you're doing this refresher course is you work with students. Every one of them is different. Everyone looks at the world differently, depending on their backgrounds. That will be some of the focus of this, the parents you work with, administrators, and colleagues. So for communication background, it may have been a while since you took communication courses in college. I have a minor in communication theory, but again, it was just theory. It wasn't all the practical stuff. And so I'd like to kind of just go over that quickly here. And you can just listen as I discuss this, maybe make some connections to the past and things that you did in college. So communication pedagogy, as we all know, the nice big word pedagogy, is just one of the studies of the field of communication education is determining the ways we teach communication competencies. So the pedagogy looks at issues that students encounter on a day-to-day basis, communication apprehension or stage fright, things like that. Developmental communication, on the other hand, is where these scholars will look at how individuals acquire or develop communication skills. Infants and language skills, how college students enhance their interpersonal communication skills. If you are in speech pathology, you've probably done a lot of work in how children develop language. And then instructional communication is where we'll focus a lot of this presentation on. That's how you scholars communicate to teach, and how they use, or scholars study how communication is used in teaching and the central role of communication in the learning process. This next section will be on becoming a competent communicator. What is communication competence? Well, to be effective communicators, we must be flexible and possess a variety of communication acts. And no matter what your title is, or your job, teacher, administrator, counselor, specialist, librarian, we all need to be effective communicators. And the simplest guidelines, depending when you're working with students, maybe you're not a classroom teacher, but when you meet with a student to talk about their registration for next year's classes, or you're meeting with them to do a session on speech language, you need to make clear what your goals are for you and the student. You need to know your content. You need to communicate to the students, adapt, and then provide feedback. The application of competencies for guidance counselors, again, you probably know these, but you can look here and it talks about some of the competencies that you need when you're a school counselor. And I just attached some for counselors, librarians, and what I could find. But building rapport, any of us need to do that. That is part of communication. Before you can work with a student or family, is you need to have trust and listening and empathy and laughter. And those are all good things for any educator. One link that I'm sharing from the state of Wisconsin is my educational specialist performance evaluation. Some school districts do this, some do Danielson. But no matter what kind of educational specialist you are, you have a performance standard on communication and collaboration. As you can see here, standard number 2. where you will have to show artifacts of you and how you communicate with parents, students, and other staff. And you will be judged on a rubric on those. So it is a big, important part of our job. Must include required documentation. So you need a documentation log of the communication and collaboration that you do with parents and students and the like. So that is some of the information on becoming a competent communicator. You can click on these links and spend some more time delving into that. What are the benefits of learning effective interpersonal communication? Now again, this is just a refresher, but it is stuff we do day to day. It is the crux of our job to get our information out, is to use communication. So in our non-classroom positions, we don't see the students every day. We don't work with them and have the chance to establish rapport as quickly as other classroom teachers would. We do serve a unique role. It's not evaluative. What I've found as the librarian is I'm not grading them. Students will talk to me. Sometimes they need an adult that isn't their parents or teacher or someone that's going to necessarily judge them or give them advice. They just want someone to talk to and listen to them. So in our jobs too, we have expectations of the students, and they do for us. One thing that I thought was important in our role as either librarian, counselor, social workers is you need to have a positive, supportive environment in order for not only your self-disclosure to students, but for them to feel comfortable disclosing to you. So you need to have positive regard for students, like I said, a supportive climate, listen, and then just be genuine. So there's some things we do have to think about. You have specific rules, especially social workers and counselors, and laws to follow. This website here has some standards that social workers have to follow, and that has some information. As with teachers, specialists, and non-classroom staff also have communication styles. I think generally we should be friendly, attentive, and relaxed, but then organized and professional. Moving on to listening. We all know we can work better at listening. The type of listening you're doing now is informative listening. You're listening to get information. So there's 4 different types of listening. I'm not going to cover those, but I'm going to talk specifically about barriers to listening. Since a big part of our job is listening to our patrons and our students, parents, things like that, are the different things that can block communication and be barriers to listening. Factual distractions are just, when we listen for facts rather than like the big picture and the whole idea. So strategies to counteract this are do listen for the whole big picture of what the student is saying, not just like the who, what, where, when, and why. Focus on the main idea, give that person a full hearing. And this especially goes true for when parents come in and they want to, you might think they're venting, but listen to the whole story, and at the end, maybe you'll be able to pull out what you need and what the main concept is. Semantic distractions, semantic having to do with language and words. These are kind of the words that will pretty much stop you from listening. You get so emotionally drawn and have reactions to those. I used to tell students there were some different speech topics that are so controversial, and things like abortion and the death penalty, where your audience isn't going to listen to you because they already have their emotional, strong feeling toward it. It's hard to persuade them otherwise. So strategies you can use are to ask for clarification for your own self. Try to overcome that reaction to those words. Focus on what you can agree on when you are kind of having one of those discussions that could be controversial. Mental distractions, that all of us have them, depending on the time of day, depending on your, state of mind. They're caused by intrapersonal, things that go on inside your head. One form of those, we focus on ourselves. Another one could be daydreaming. So strategies are to concentrate on what the other person is saying, listen with all your senses, use a lot of body language, write things down if you need to, and don't let yourself zone out. And don't be thinking, one of the things I do is try to form my response before they're even done telling the problem. And then lastly is physical distractions, and those can take many forms. Again, the color of the room, the time of the day, the clothing, the noises, things that can interfere with one's ability to listen. And with students, this could be many things. If you have stuff on your desk and you're trying to have a meeting with a student and they start playing with all that, that's a distraction. So try to remove physical barriers. A desk itself, I personally in my library, I do have a circulation desk, but I've tried to open it up where people feel that they can come stand next to me and look on the computer, where it's not this huge, gated off area where I'm stuck behind there and I'm not approachable. Okay, other things you can do, manipulate the environment for optimal results. We're moving on to verbal and nonverbal communication techniques. For our positions, we aren't necessarily standing up lecturing the entire time, so the verbal technique that I'm choosing to focus on is the appropriateness. Also being appropriate with our students' parents, administrators, staff, and striving to use language that is inclusive. These are two things that I really took away from the textbook I'm using here. Teacher appropriateness, we should be sure that language we use is appropriate, or educator appropriateness. Students may respond differently to some of the words and phrases that we use, so we have to think of that. Inclusive language is, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, and forth, especially if we're in a counseling role or working one-on-one with students, to kind of be appropriate and be clear. One of the examples I have could be where if you're working with a group of a class of students, and on class registration, plan out what you will say, anticipate questions, be articulate, have good volume in the lab or classroom. Don't go on and on. Kids will want to get the information and then go ahead and register. At least that's what I've seen. Change your rate and pitch so students stay engaged. That's always just general public speaking technique. For nonverbal, the main techniques I like to cover are liking and affect, and regulation of conversational flow, and environmental factors. There are many other nonverbal, communication aspects, but I thought these ones would be most relevant to us in our field as educational specialists. So nonverbal immediacy is perceived positively by students. Immediacy is smiling, removing physical barriers, eye contact. Those are things that we can do to make our affect open, make students like us. Just in general, if you look approachable and happy to be helping them, then they'll come to you. Regulation of conversational flow. When there's a teacher talking and they're in a position of power, sage on the stage, it's a little bit different. But even in your office, if you're working with a student and trying to listen to them, again, let them do the talking. They have the information that you need. So they need to feel that they have a little bit of power in the conversation. And using nonverbal clues like eye contact, things like that. And then environmental factors are, again, like I mentioned before, is just how you set up, how you make people feel comfortable, how you can make yourself approachable. So an example would be if a student comes in your office for speech therapy, if the room is cramped and has thin walls and you can hear the classroom next door and other people's interaction, then that's going to make it hard for your session to go as well. So you can change that. In part 3, we're going to focus on instructional strategies. There's a little quote here that I found. If you are building a culture where honest expectations are communicated and peer accountability is the norm, then the group will address poor performance and attitudes. So with instructional strategies, if you can build it, then the students themselves will regulate it, and that's the idea. With instructional strategies, because we're non-classroom teachers, we're working with students that aren't ours. We don't know them as well. There's a lot to think about when planning the strategies and the setup. We should keep in mind what motivates our students. For example, going back to educational psychology, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Okay, so the idea that students, if they don't have the things at the bottom of the hierarchy, they will not listen, they will not be able to get the understanding and learn. We're working with them on their basic needs. And then maybe up to belongingness and esteem needs, especially if you're a counselor, if you're a social worker, if you're working with students and needing to listen, you need to understand their safety and physiological needs. So some of the strategies that I'd like to focus on would be a whole group lecture, where you are the one person talking and you're giving information to the whole class. Or it could even be you are training a group of teachers. But in the whole group lecture model, I would be the example, the librarian teaching about databases, where I'm going to take maybe 20 minutes to explain them, to go through, to show, but they're going to be listening and taking notes, possibly on their computers, doing that. Another strategy would be small group discussion. If you're a social worker conducting a session for staff, possibly on ADD, you might break the teachers into tables to give examples. You might go around and work with that small group. You might be working just with a department. So you might come in and say some of the students that we have that you've noticed that need some extra help. You might be even on an IEP. An IEP could be considered like a small group discussion. Another strategy would be experiential learning and role playing. If you're a counselor running a support group, let's say on eating disorders, you will have students possibly, role playing different reactions, different things that they're doing to kind of feel things out. And then one-on-one instruction. As a librarian, I do this a lot. Guidance counselors working with students on next year's course registration might be one example where they come in during their lunch, during their study hall, and you sit with them and listen to what they want and help them find the best class for themselves. So again, getting the most out of your time with students, because that's limited. Choose your strategy after analyzing your goal and your student's goal, and then decide if a one-on-one, if a group lecture model will work best. The last part of the training will be on ethics and diversity. We need to help students and parents cherish and preserve the ethnic and cultural diversity that nourishes and strengthens this community and this nation. Cesar Chavez. And this is an important quote. This is an important thing to think about, that maybe we as teachers, we think about the diversity, or we as educators think about diversity, but we don't always think about ethics and all the things that we have to do and the importance of that. So the role of ethics in your job. The general, if you work in a school, you have the general guidelines of ethics, your personal credo, your classroom credo, if you have a classroom, or even your office, or in my case, my library. But what ethics is the systematic study of value concepts such as good, bad, and right, and the application of such terms to actions, to intentions, and to descriptors of character. In this sense, ethics is concerned with how one ought to teach and what constitutes a good teacher, and then values of power, fairness, honesty, trustworthiness, and knowledge. And there's going to be ethical dilemmas. So you have to have those kind of ethics, your credo set up so that if things do happen, ethical dilemmas that could happen with educational specialists, parents complaining, favoritism, teachers trying to, students trying to switch out of classes with certain teachers they don't like. For me in the library, things like plagiarism, copyright, those are all different dilemmas that we might face. Some of the guidelines for ethical decision making then, need to be based, you have to think of the standards that you have. So when certain issues come, there's the religious or moral part, there's political things to consider, human nature, that's a big one. Think in terms of the parent or the student. A parent gets upset, we might think they're a helicopter parent, but they really want the best for their child. So you need to honor that and turn it back on how we can best meet the needs of that child. There's different situational things that can come up. If you are a guidance counselor meeting with a student of this opposite sex, should you leave your door open when you're meeting? Are you going to be accused of things with the student? Even as teachers, we all need to be aware of that. And then the application of ethics, just creating a positive climate in your field, in your room, in your library, in your office. You should be setting that up to be supportive so that everyone can come to you. The way that you schedule your appointments, the way that you provide feedback for students, the way that you communicate with parents. Remember, calling on positive things too, not just negative things that happen. So with ethics is just thinking about having integrity, honoring the profession, and maintaining yourself in a, ethical way. We all know we should do that, but things happen. Now we're switching on to the isms, I call it. The different, the differences, in our world, and especially as teachers, we have this all the time where we have to deal with students. There's things like sexism, ethnocentrism, classism, racism, and ableism that we have to deal with. And I'm going to link up to a diversity training that I put together. And you do not have to go through all of this by any means. But there are different things that I would like to focus on here quickly. But basically understanding diversity, cultural differences. We need to be aware of the differences and how we communicate with students. With racism, I guess one of the things to be aware of is African American English. That's one of the ones I chose to focus on because my population in my school, there are many students that are Chapter 220 students and from the inner city that come in to our suburban school district. But even as a counselor or educational specialist, speech pathologist, you will need to understand this to work with these students. Okay, the other one is ethnocentrism, where one culture thinks they are better than another. Okay, and I think the part that was interesting to me, as you read this list below, think of examples from your own teaching experience. Would you consider yourself more student-centered, where the students are allowed to criticize the adult, speak spontaneously, so even when students come meet with you in your office, I mean, if you're a guidance counselor or social worker, do you let them initiate communication? Okay, then you'd be the small power distance, whereas the large power distance societies, some of the more Eastern cultures, you know, students don't talk unless they're directed by the teacher. The teacher is never contradicted or criticized. And I generally find that most of our schools are small power distance societies. And the thing about ethnocentrism is to try to break down that barrier, that not think that if you have white privilege. I mean, there's tons of stuff that I could go on and on about with that, but I think what we'll do is move on to classism, because this is something, socioeconomic status, that you will be dealing with in 21st century schools. Some of the gaps that we talk about with SAT scores, with high stakes testing. There are gaps depending on the student, how much income their parents make. And you might have access to that information with the parents and the socioeconomic. You might deal with parents who come into your guidance office and demand this or that, depending on who they are in the community. There's examples of parents going to colleges, to the admissions counselors, and demanding that their kids get in, bribing, things like that. But again, in our buildings, we need to maybe educate teachers about this. So if you have access to the information, if your student's in their IEPs and you need to explain, the student is homeless, the student lives with foster parents, he can't afford these library fees, those are all things that you can let your staff know. And me at my particular school, we were working to make equity and getting more students enrolled in AP classes. The next ism is ableism, where students with disabilities are discriminated against, maybe unintentionally. So there are many students here at this school, at your school, that have learning disabilities, physical, mental, and things that we need to think about. These kids tend to have higher dropout rates, poor self-concept, negative attitudes, the faculty that they deal with, less supportive classrooms. So again, as a counselor, as a specialist, social worker, librarian, you can help break down these barriers. You can interact with people. I thought these 10 tips for communicating with people with disabilities was very helpful. Speak directly. Don't speak extra loud. Just treat them as you would anyone else. Listen attentively. Place yourself at eye level when speaking to someone that might be in a wheelchair or on crutches. It's more condescending to look down at them or to lean on their wheelchair, things like that. This way you're putting yourself eye to eye with them so that they can either know that you treat them the same instead of the power position. And just relax, like it says. We probably all have said things that may be inappropriate, but they understand, and you just work from that. You don't avoid communication just because you don't want to offend someone. Lastly is sexism. This is an important, passionate topic to me as a woman, as a female teacher, and as a person who purchases books for my library. I want to try to make it so there aren't gender biases or gender stereotypes. In textbooks, I can't really control that because it's been proven that there are. But there are examples of, even still today, things being sold where girls is pink and how to be gorgeous and just about looks, whereas boys, how to be clever. These are some books that children are reading. So I'd like to, focus on gender-free language and encouraging your female students to take as many classes in science and math that they want, things like that. Maybe running a gender equity group if you're a guidance counselor or social worker, or the GSA, which is Gay Straight Alliance. So just being supportive, putting a rainbow sticker on your classroom window, your library window, your office, showing that you support students with questioning their sexuality. So again, we as educators understand that there's diversity. Sometimes you just need to review it and think of ways to, in your classroom or in your office, in your job, to make it work. You can bring this training to your district. I highly suggest Beyond Diversity training. It's usually a 2-day session, or teachers can get sent to it from different departments. It's amazing. It's uncomfortable at times. It really makes you think of, the different privileges that we have and that we don't even think about. This article here, In Blind Pursuit of Racial Equality, this talks about the idea of schools trying to maybe, meaning well, but to kind of get rid of the looking at the color of a student. But then it's been kind of found that if you train little kids this way, where everyone's the same, then they don't realize they're doing the bullying. So the article, later on, because they're bullying just maybe based on other things, but it has been found that when you do the color. And lastly, when you're working with students, either in group work, or you can tell teachers about this, these are some quizzes on some of the different diversity things we were talking about, multiculturalism. It's a good one just to take yourself as a refresher to see how you'll do. There's an online quiz on gender equity and then an article on gender equity and STEM education. So those are just some resources for you, the communication concerns when working with students. And then lastly, in conclusion, some of the things we covered were communication competencies and some of the background on communication, some different techniques you can use verbally and non-verbally, instructional strategies, 4 strategies, and some of the skills needed with that. And then lastly, ethics and diversity and how ethics plays a role in your position, and then some of the communication concerns with diversity in your classroom or in your job. And again, communication is the channel and learning is the goal. So if you ignore the communication, you just assume you have great listening and speaking skills and don't ever refresh them, then you're really doing yourself and your students a disservice. So thank you for your time, taking the time to listen, read, participate, and think about how communication techniques affect your job in education.